Good morning and welcome to this webinar on regulatory action. My name is Charene Nortier and I'm from the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, Conduct of Business Supervision Division. With me is my colleague Ngcobo, who is an expert on regulatory action. Becky, thank you so much for sharing this information with us today. I think it is going to be incredibly valuable and useful to FSPs and their staff.
Thank you, Charene, for the introduction and greetings to everybody watching the webinar. As my colleague Charene has said, I am a manager in the Financial Advisors and Intermediaries Department under the Conduct of Business Division. I mainly work with regulatory action. So today I will be taking you through regulatory action in as far as it relates to suspension of licenses, withdrawal of licenses, provisional suspension of licenses, as well as provisional withdrawal of licenses. I will also touch on penalties in terms of Section 167 of the FSR Act. My other colleagues in another part of the webinar will come in to deal with debarments. So I will start with explaining the provisions that the FSCA takes regulatory action on. Regulatory action is that I will be discussing today is in terms of Section 9 of the FAIS Act, which states that the FSCA may, in terms of Section 9 of the FAIS Act, at any time suspend or withdraw any license if satisfied on the basis of available facts and information that the licensee does not meet or no longer meets the fit and proper requirements, or the only key individual or all key individuals of the licensee no longer meet the fit and proper requirements. Secondly, where the FSP did not, when applying for a license, make full disclosure of relevant information to the FSCA or furnished false or misleading information. And then thirdly, where the FSP has failed to comply with the provisions of this Act, as well as any requirement under the FSR Act, including a conduct standard, prudential standard, or a joint standard. The reference to the two legislation, the FAIS Act and the FSR Act, which is the Financial Sector Regulation Act, also refers to subordinate legislation, which will include the relevant codes of conduct, the board notices, and so on. And then fourthly, where the FSP has failed to pay a levy, an administrative penalty, or any interest in respect thereof. And then fifthly, where the FSP does not have an approved key individual. And then sixth, where the FSP has failed to comply with a regulator's directive. It can either be a directive in terms of the FAIS Act or the FSR Act. And then lastly, where the FSP has failed to comply with any condition or restriction posed under the Act. Okay, I will start with suspensions. With suspensions, the FSCA will look at this option to deal with contraventions that can be rectified, contraventions of the FAIS Act or the FSR Act, as mentioned earlier, under the grounds. Like for an example where the FSP has failed to submit financial statements as required in terms of Section 19 of the FAIS Act, or has failed to submit compliance reports, or does not have a suitable guarantee, and so on and so forth. What happens when with this process of suspension is that information of contravention is received either internally from our other sister departments or from external parties. What happens is that when we receive the information, we then verify whether indeed there is a contravention, and in some instances where we're required to investigate in order to establish whether indeed there was a contravention, we do that. And once satisfied that there is a contravention, then the FSCA will issue to the FSP a notice called Notice of Intention to Suspend, and will afford the FSP 14 days within which to respond to the Notice of Intention to Suspend or to rectify the contravention. Once a response is received, same will be analyzed, and if necessary, if there is insufficient information or clarity that is still required, then we will liaise further with the FSP. If the FSCA is satisfied that FSP has rectified the contravention based on the submissions made by the FSP, then the FSCA will then proceed to will then proceed to close the matter and inform the FSP accordingly. But where the FSP fails to respond or to rectify the contravention within the time provided, which is 14 days, then the FSCA will then proceed with the suspension of the license of that FSP. So once the FSP is suspended, it is suspended for a period of 3 months. Within this period, the FSP is still has an opportunity to rectify the contraventions that have been identified and which have been brought to the attention of the FSP. But during that period of suspension, the FSP is not allowed to conduct any financial services up until the license has been lifted. So once the FSCA has received a response or submissions indicating that the licensee has in fact rectified whatever contravention, if it's the non-payment of levies, for an example, where the FSP has provided proof of payment, or if it's the non-submission of financial statements where the FSP has in fact submitted financial statements, The FSCA will then look at the submissions made and the information provided, and then come to a decision. If the FSCA is satisfied that the contravention has been rectified, then the FSCA will then proceed to lift the suspension, and then the FSP will then be allowed to render financial services again. So all regulatory action where the FSCA either takes the decision through a suspension or a withdrawal, those powers are delegated to the Transitional Management Committee in terms of the FSR Act. So those decisions must be made by that committee for them to be valid, as the FSR Act only delegates these powers to the Transitional Management Committee. So what happens, the department within the COB that is working either on a suspension or a withdrawal of a license, or a provisional suspension or a provisional withdrawal, will present the matter or the recommendations to the Transitional Management Committee, who will then make a decision whether to suspend or to withdraw. All suspension, all decisions to suspend a license must be published on the FSCA website or any other appropriate media. Okay, now I will be moving on to, okay, before I move on to withdrawals, okay, I must make another point that any FSP that is the subject of the FSCA's decision to suspend a license can apply for the reconsideration of the decision by the Financial Services Tribunal, which is an independent body from the FSCA. And the FSCA can also, in terms of Section 95 of the FSR Act, also revoke its decision to suspend a license if the decision was made for under there are three instances where the FSCA can take a decision to revoke its decisions. So firstly, where the decision was made as a result of fraud or irregularity. Secondly, where the information on which the decision is based was incomplete or inaccurate, and the FSCA would have come to a different decision had the information been complete or accurate. And then lastly, if the decision is for any reason invalid. So those are only instances where the FSCA can actually revoke its own decision in terms of Section 95 of the FSR Act. Okay, I will now be moving on to the withdrawal of licenses. Okay, A withdrawal of a license can either follow from the suspension, or the process can be initiated from the beginning as a withdrawal. So with the withdrawal following from a suspension, it happens where, as discussed earlier, where a license has been suspended for 3 months and the FSP has failed to rectify the contraventions that have been brought to their attention, then the FSCA will then proceed to withdraw that license. So what I didn't mention while dealing with suspension is that when the FSCA suspends a license, it issues what is called a notice of suspension. So that notice of suspension also serves as a notice of intention to withdraw the license of that FSP if that FSP does not comply with the terms for the lifting of the suspension, or does not rectify the contraventions. So after a period of 3 months and the contraventions have still not been rectified, or the suspension has not been lifted, then the FSCA will issue a notice called Notice of Withdrawal, now withdrawing that license because the FSP has failed to rectify the contraventions within the 3 months period. Okay, moving on to the other instance where a withdrawal is initiated as a withdrawal. It is done mostly in instances where there is a contravention that cannot be rectified. For an example, where the only key individual or all key individuals of the licensee no longer meet the fit and proper requirements relating to honesty and integrity. Usually, in these instances, this process of withdrawal will be accompanied by a debarment where the key individuals no longer meet the fit and proper requirements relating to honesty and integrity. So, as with the suspension, the FSCA will receive information either from the members of the public, other regulators, which will be in the form of allegations, sometimes supported by evidence. And then those allegations will be investigated by the FSCA if any evidence or prima facie evidence is found that the licensee is no longer fit and proper, and then the FSCA will issue a notice called Notice of Intention to Withdraw the license's authorization. The notice will be based on the contravention of the honesty and integrity requirement. The the FSP is given 14 days within which to respond and to make submissions to the FSCA and to show why it is of the view that it does no longer meet the fit and proper requirements. So once a response is received, it is analyzed and considered. If the FSCA is, even after the submissions made by the FSP or in the absence of any submissions made, if it is still of the view that there is evidence that the FSP or its key individuals no longer meet the fit and proper requirements relating to honesty and integrity, then the FSCA will then proceed to withdraw that license. In doing so, the FSCA will issue a notice called the Notice of Withdrawal. So once a notice of withdrawal has been issued, that notice must be published on the FSCA website or any other appropriate media. In most cases, it will be on the website. So as with the suspensions, the affected FSP, that is the subject of the FSCA's decision, can also apply to the Financial Services Tribunal for the reconsideration of the FSCA's decision, which used to be called the appeal in the previous regime. The decision to withdraw can also be revoked by the FSCA in terms of Section 95 of the FSR Act. Okay, moving on to provisional suspensions and withdrawal of licenses. Okay, the provisional suspension or withdrawal is where the FSCA immediately withdraws a license or suspends a license prior to affording the affected FSP an opportunity to respond, or prior to the FSCA actually investigating and considering the matter. It is usually done under urgent circumstances where the FSCA is satisfied that on reasonable grounds that substantial prejudice to clients or general public may occur if the license is not immediately suspended or withdrawn. This is in terms of Section 9, subsection 3 of the FAIS Act. The Act is not prescriptive on the ground, but it says on reasonable grounds. Maybe one can just make an example of such instances, like for an example where a licensed FSP information comes to the attention of the FSCA that the FSP may be using the license maybe in an irregular way to maybe sell, for an example, a product that is not regulated by the FSCA, or maybe using the license to scam the public. In such instances, the FSCA may actually trying to prevent potential victims from harm, can actually either provisionally withdraw or suspend the license. So what happens when the FSCA provisionally suspends or withdraw a license? It issues a notice called a notice of provisional suspension, or a notice of provisional withdrawal, as the case may be. On the day of the issuing of that notice, the license will be either suspended or withdrawn, as the case may be. And during that period, the FSP will not be authorized to render any financial services. The FSP will then be given time. It can be 30 days or more to respond to the notice of provisional suspension or withdrawal. And the FSCA will also be investigating the matter during the provisional suspension or withdrawal. If after the investigation and where the FSCA is satisfied that there is evidence of a contravention, the FSCA will then proceed to finally suspend or withdraw that license by issuing a notice of final suspension or final withdrawal. If the FSCA is of the view that there is not sufficient, or there is no evidence that there has been a contravention after the investigation and the submissions made by the FSP concerned, then the FSCA will move or will proceed to either, to lift the provisional suspension or withdrawal, and that will be the end of the matter. Okay. I must also mention that the provisional suspension or withdrawal must be published on the website or any other appropriate media. That will also apply to the final decision to either finally suspend or withdraw the license, and if the decision is to lift the provisional withdrawal, then that must also be published on the website or any other appropriate media. Any FSP or the FSP that is the subject of the decision to provisionally suspend or to provisionally withdraw can apply to the Financial Services Tribunal for a reconsideration of the FSCA's decision. as well as the final suspension, the FSP can apply to the tribunal for the reconsideration of that decision. As with the suspensions and withdrawal, provisional suspensions and withdrawals those decisions are delegated to the Transitional Management Committee. They are the ones who make the decision. Okay, that is all with regards to the suspensions, withdrawals, provisional suspensions and provisional withdrawals. So now we are moving on to instances where the FSCA does not necessarily take away the license of the FSP, but imposes a penalty based on a contravention. So in terms of Section 167 of the Financial Sector Regulation Act, the FSCA may, by order served on a person, impose on the person an appropriate administrative penalty that must be paid to the financial sector regulator if the person has contravened a financial sector law or has contravened an enforceable undertaking accepted by the responsible authority. There is a separate section in the FSR Act dealing with enforceable undertakings, but we will, for the purposes of this webinar, we will not be going into that. As with the withdrawals and suspensions, the FSCA will receive information of a contravention either from the members of the public, the other regulators, clients, and so on. And then those allegations are investigated by the FSCA. Where evidence of a contravention is found, the analyst will make, working on the matter, will make recommendations to a forum called Regulatory Action Forum, established in terms of the Financial Sector Regulation Act. So the matter will then be considered by the Regulatory Action Forum. If the Regulatory Action Forum is satisfied that there is prima facie evidence of a contravention, then they will give an instruction for the issuing of a notice of intention to impose an administrative penalty to the FSP or individual involved. So the said notice of intention to impose an administrative penalty will contain the reasons, the contraventions identified, as well as the actual proposed penalty. Then on receiving this notice, the FSP will be given an opportunity to respond to the notice and to give reasons as to why a penalty should not be imposed, or why it is of the view that it has not contravened the provisions that have been identified in the notice, or even to comment on the actual proposed penalty, if it is of the view that maybe a lesser penalty amount should be paid. So once the FSCA receives, okay, before I move on to that, the FSP or the individual concerned will have 30 days within which to respond to the notice. If the FSP or the individual concerned fails to respond to the notice, then the Regulatory Action Forum will consider the matter in the absence of the FSP's or the individual's submissions, and under these circumstances, in most likelihood, the Regulatory Action Forum will proceed to take a decision to impose the proposed administrative penalty. Once the FSP or individual consent makes the necessary submissions to the notice of intention to impose an administrative penalty, then all the submissions, supporting documents, evidence is considered, and then another sitting of Regulatory Action Forum is arranged for the forum to consider the submissions and every other information that is available, and to come to a final decision whether to impose the penalty or not to impose the penalty based on all the available information. In these circumstances where the FSP or the individual consent has made the necessary submissions, on deliberating on the matter, the Regulatory Action Forum will take one of the following decisions: either not to impose the administrative penalty as proposed in the notice of intention to impose an administrative penalty, or impose the penalty as contained in the notice of intention to impose an administrative penalty, or impose a reconsidered penalty amount. The decision of the RAF must be communicated to the FSP or the individual consent. The FSCA's decision in this regard must also be made public, either on the FSCA website or any appropriate media. Any person or aggrieved by the decision, or that is the subject of the FSCA's decision to impose an administrative penalty, may approach the Financial Services Tribunal to apply for the reconsideration of the FSCA's decision. we have reached the end of the webinar. So for any questions, we will be leaving a link on the webinar for anyone who has questions or comments to send us those comments via email or any appropriate communication, the details of which will be provided. So thank you. We've reached the end.
Becky, thank you very much. I think this was incredibly valuable. It explains the process that is followed and what for me is a couple of key takeaways from this webinar is the fact that whether it is an intention to suspend, an intention to withdraw, or even a provisional suspension withdrawal, or in the last instance that you explained, the administrative penalties, FSPs or respondents always have an opportunity to provide information back to the FSCA. We do not just take these actions in isolation. FSPs and respondents are given an opportunity to talk to the FSCA, to explain reasons and to make recommendations as to why certain actions should not be taken or whether there should be a reduction in the case of a penalty, for instance. The other key takeaway is the role of the tribunal. And I'm not always sure that people understand that there is recourse to the tribunal. So thank you so much for explaining this in detail. So from our side, we also want to just tell you that we have accredited this webinar with the Financial Planning Institute for CPD purposes. For those of you who see this as an ideal opportunity to not only increase your knowledge, but to also obtain CPD recognition for that, you have to complete the assessment. And you will also find the link in this webinar registration. You have to register and then you have to complete the assessment. If you battle with some of the questions, all of the questions are based on the information contained on the slides and in the discussion. You're most welcome to re-watch the webinar so that you can find the answers if you don't find the answer immediately when you are responding to the assessment. On successful completion of the assessment, you will then be able to download a CPD certificate that will be part of your CPD records. So thank you again for participating in the webinar. We hope that you will find this valuable and important information. Becky, again, thank you for your time and the effort that you've put into the preparation. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at our next webinar.